So a few days ago, when I was thinking about this talk, and I was thinking about what's the purpose of this talk? And there were two words that came to mind, and those were self-improvement. And as I was working on this talk, as I was thinking about it, I was also thinking about another talk that I was scheduled to give this week on a completely different topic. But as often happens when you give talks from a liberty perspective, an individualist perspective, you tend to face some opposition, some resistance. And when you talk about more controversial things, sometimes that opposition is much stronger. And a few days ago, I found myself facing incredibly strong opposition. I was scheduled to give a talk at King's College London, and the talk was picked up by certain social media influencers who had sent many of their followers to try and intimidate myself and some of the other speakers on the panel from talking. And as I was receiving these intimidatory messages and even some death threats, it suddenly hit me. The two are not unrelated. And the lessons that I want to talk about today are the exact lessons that I've been applying these past few days to deal with this incident, and the exact lessons that these people had never learned. And as I was receiving these death threats, I realized that this talk is not only about self-improvement, but more than that. It is literally, at the extreme, a matter of life and death. So you might ask, why is it relevant? Why do we not just learn modern lessons for modern times? Why look back at the ancient Greeks? And this has to do with aspects of our nature. Human nature is fixed. Human nature is not malleable. An ancient Greek, qua human being, is no different than you or I or any of us. The ancient Greeks had relationships much like we do today. They had families, they had friends, they had lovers, they had trade relationships, they had teachers, mentors, etc. And they also engaged in productive activity, just like we do. The only difference is that we talk to our friends via a phone, and they might have done it via letters or at the local market. So the ancient Greeks are more similar to us than we think, and I tried to emphasize that with this AI-designed image, which is quite incredible if you ignore the fact that the Greek has 6 fingers. That's not how the Greeks actually were. But using AI is more difficult than you think. So, if you don't know much about the ancient Greeks, I just want to give a brief background as to what I mean when I say the ancient Greek civilization. So, here you see a map of what I call ancient Greece, and you'll notice that it's actually not only in Greece. It's all over Europe, Africa, and Asia. And when we talk about ancient Greece, we're not talking about Greek as we know it today, but we're talking about really a civilization, almost an empire, although of course they weren't an empire. All of the Greeks were spread across the Mediterranean, and the ancient Greek civilization was comprised of city-states, independent city-states, so of course not an empire. And when we talk of ancient Greek civilization and culture, we're not talking about any particular state, but an overarching themes, overarching stories, overarching culture that underlie what it means to be an ancient Greek. Now, I want to emphasize at the get-go that it doesn't, no matter what lesson we are going to talk about today, there are going to be exceptions to its application in ancient Greece, and almost all of those exceptions are going to be in Sparta. So if you want to ask a little bit more about Sparta in the Q&A, I welcome you to. But again, just going back to the ancient Greeks now, so As you can see, they're spread out all across the Mediterranean. Plato famously compared the Greeks to frogs because they're kind of all hurdled around the water's edge. And the Greeks were a flourishing civilization. The Greeks flourished in pretty much every aspect of human endeavor. They flourished economically, they flourished politically, they flourished in terms of trade, they flourished in terms of art, they flourished in pretty much every realm of the imagination, anything that can come to mind. But that didn't last, and eventually we saw a decline in the classical Greek world. And I'm not going to get into that in this talk, but again, you're welcome to ask more about that in the Q&A. One of the most significant aspects of flourishing that took place in ancient Greece was the birth of philosophy. For the first time in history, in recorded history, we see a transition from mythos to logos, a transition from attempts to explain the world around us, the phenomena that we see and encounter, rather than through mythology, through stories, and having to extract lessons and morals through those, but trying to explain the world around us through rational reasons. And it's not surprising that it happened in Greece, and we're going to discuss a little bit of pre-philosophy, ancient Greek thinkers, and really get a sense of why philosophy, why for the first time in recorded history, human beings have existed for tens of thousands of years beforehand, but why now do we see a transition, and such a crucial transition from mythos to logos? And I want to start this talk by discussing a pre-philosophy Greek and really emphasize the central tenets of Greek culture pre-philosophy. So what do we mean when we talk about Greek culture? And the first thinker I want to talk about is probably the most prominent pre-philosophy Greek, probably the most influential pre-philosophy Greek, most impactful, and one of the greatest poets of all time, and that is Homer. Homer flourished around the 8th century BC. When we say flourished, we mean this is the time in which the dominant activity took place. And Homer, there are many things that are said about him. A little bit of background about Homer. So it's uncertain whether this was one man or a collection of individuals, similar to how we think of Shakespeare. And Homer was a great poet. Homer wrote two main works of literature. He wrote the Iliad, which is a story of a segment of the Trojan War. Does anyone here not know about the Trojan War? Okay, so you can ask me more about that later if you like, but essentially it's a mythological war that is not too certain if it actually took place, but it was incredibly influential on Greek culture in terms of the morals and stories that developed from it. And he also wrote the Odyssey. The Odyssey is the story following essentially the Iliad. It's a story about Odysseus, a hero of the Trojan War, who, after the conclusion of the war, wants to go home and reunite with his wife, wants to set sail and just retire, live a peaceful life at home with his wife Penelope. And the Odyssey and the Iliad were incredible, it's very difficult to overemphasize how influential these are in Greek culture. So many of the Greeks knew the entire poems off by heart. They could recite them. Can anyone here recite a poem? Because I can't, and we're talking short ones. I mean, he can, but I can't. And if you read the Odyssey and the Iliad, they're quite long, quite extensive. Aristotle, he is quoted calling the Odyssey constructed as well as possible. Aristotle doesn't just give out compliments willy-nilly. So these two works are incredibly influential. Now, I want to talk about the Odyssey. I want to talk about a couple of lessons actually that we can learn from the Odyssey. It's one of my favorite works of ancient literature. And as I said, the Odyssey is a story of Odysseus, a hero of the Trojan War who wants to return home to his wife, and he sets sail, and in a journey that was supposed to last a matter of weeks, a matter of months, ends up taking him 10 years because of unfortunate winds and challenges and problems and adventures that he must overcome in order to make it home to his wife Penelope. Now, there's a view in which he comes home to his wife, and his wife says to him, "Where the hell have you been?" And he's like, "Oh, well, there was a troll, and there was unfortunate winds." But putting that aside, and taking the view that he did in fact encounter these things, and he's not just coming up with those husbandly excuses, I want to talk about what it means to actually set sail and return home. So, does anyone know the ancient Greek word for mind, for reason? Aristotle talks about this a lot. Aristotle was in fact called the nous of the academy. Nous is the ancient Greek word for wisdom, for mind, for reason. And it didn't surprise me when I learned that the ancient Greek word for ship is nous. And I think Homer here is trying to make a very subtle point. Homer here is telling us that Odysseus is both the master of mind and ship. Odysseus is not only a great thinker, but he's a great actor. He takes great actions. And he's not also just a great hero, but he's also a fantastic thinker. And Homer is telling us that if you master your mind, you can master your ship. That you have to be able to master your mind if you want to master your ship. If you master your mind, you can master the world. And most fundamentally, he's telling us that to think is literally to live. If you want to live, you have to think. Thinking is the most fundamental act that one can do. And the Odyssey is such a great work because, to my knowledge, it is the first historical work of literature that demonstrates the importance of being an autonomous being, the importance of autonomous man and woman. In the Odyssey, over 90% of all of the decisions made in the stories are made by thinking people uninterrupted by the gods. If you read any ancient mythology, usually the gods are kind of like puppet masters. Well, not in the Odyssey. In the Odyssey, over 90% of the decisions made are made by thinking people, uninterrupted by the gods. And Homer here is telling us, he's really, and it's all implicit, and this is the difference between mythos and logos, but he's really telling the Greeks, guys, you've got to think. Thinking is not just a luxury that we do, it's something you must do. You've got to think in order to live. And then he says, you got to think. It's not you, it's you and you and you. Like, you guys have to think, each and every one of you. And that is one of the reasons why I absolutely love the Odyssey. I think it's one of the greatest works of ancient literature. Now, that was all pre-philosophy. I want to now jump 400 years into the future, post-birth of philosophy, and I want to talk about two of my favorite ancient Greeks, and I'm sure you would have heard of at least one of them. I want to talk about Socrates and Plato. So, a bit of background about these two rascals. Socrates is more of a street philosopher. Socrates didn't actually write any philosophy himself. Socrates preceded Plato by a matter of several decades. He was actually Plato's teacher. They both flourished around the 5th, 4th century BC, and they both lived in Athens. They both existed in Athens. Now, when I say Socrates was a street philosopher, what do I mean by that? So, Socrates would walk around town. And it's important to note that Socrates arises as a response to a preceding school of philosophers. Now, this preceding school are called the Sophists, which is where we get modern sophistry from. And the Sophists essentially believed that there is no such thing as truth. There is no such thing as true morality. And they believed that because they said, well, that guy says justice is X and that girl says justice is Y, so they disagree. Who's to agree? Who knows? And they're the first avowed skeptics in history. Now, Socrates arises as a response to them. And we learn about Socrates through Plato in what are known as the Socratic dialogues. In the Socratic dialogues, we learn about how and what Socrates did in encountering these sophists. So Socrates would walk around Athens and he'd frequent the marketplace. He'd see a sophist or a statesman. Often the two are interrelated or overlap. And he'd overhear a conversation. He'd hear them say, oh, I just came out of the Senate and we passed a really just law. And Socrates would then butt in and say, oh, did you pass a just law? Is that so? What is justice? What do you mean by justice? And the sophist or the statesman would say, what do you mean, what do I mean by justice? Everyone knows what justice is. Don't be ridiculous. But Socrates is one of the most famous quotes that he has is, I know that I know nothing. And he doesn't actually mean that. But what he means is that he knows that a lot of people use these high-level abstractions but don't actually know literally what they mean or very precisely what they mean. So he would continue questioning them. And he'd say, well, look, I don't know what justice is. Could you please tell me what you mean by that? And the sophist would then give some offhand definition, and Socrates would then say, oh, okay, interesting. Well, if you mean this, doesn't this follow? And he'd continue with this line of questioning until he had pointed out that they don't actually know what they're talking about. And there's plenty of internal inconsistencies in their definitions. Now, that's what is known as the Socratic method. So that's a bit about Socrates. Plato now. So, as I mentioned, Plato was a student of Socrates. Plato would follow Socrates around. There were many others who did this, but Plato was amongst one of them. And what Plato did is take the teachings of Socrates, systematize them, integrate more ideas that, or include more ideas that integrate into the Socratic system and comprise a unified whole. And Socrates is Plato is the first philosopher in history to develop a system of philosophy, an integrated system of philosophy comprising of the 5 main branches of philosophy. And for that, it is practically impossible to overestimate how much of a genius he must have been. So that's a bit of background about the two. Well, what do they have to teach us? So the sophists tell us that you just ought to act on any emotion or whim that you have, because there is no truth, there is no morality, so just do whatever the hell you want. And if you have a good emotion, well, great. And if you had a bad one, well, fine, act on it anyway. And Socrates and Plato, they combat that notion, the notion that you are bad by nature. And they say, no, guys, no one is bad by nature. The reason why people are bad, the reason why people do things that are not virtuous, act in ways that are unjust, is because they're ignorant. People are not bad by nature, they're bad by ignorance. And they make a really, really profound observation. And this may seem too commonsensical for us, but at the time, they say that if you want to know what virtue, if you want to be virtuous, if you want to be just, if you want to be righteous, you have to know what it is to be just. You have to know what it is to be righteous. You can't just say, I want to live a happy life without knowing what happiness is. You can't just say, I want to live a virtuous life. I want to be proud. Well, what do those things mean? They say you have to know what those things mean. Over the course of this conference, this has been a recurring theme where people have said definitions matter, words matter. Well, this is where it comes down to. Like, this is the origin of what Andrew and some of the other speakers have been talking about. And when I was reading the Socratic dialogues, I enjoyed them for two reasons. One, because they're entertaining. Socrates really just tears apart these sophists, but also because it resonated with me. I was having so many conversations, debates, discussions with people, family, friends, intellectual opponents, whatever you want to call them. And we were having like conversations up here, but we were not agreeing on terms down here, and everything was getting lost in translation because we just didn't have our definitions right. And here is one example of what I'm talking about. So all of these people are just talking about equality, each and every one of them. Do you think they're talking about the same equality? Because I don't. There might be some overlap between some of the pictures there, and I think that there is, but this is a demonstration of why it is so important to know what you're talking about, to have your definitions tied to reality. And when Plato and Socrates teach us that to be virtuous, you need to know what it is, to be righteous, you need to know what it is, they're telling us about the importance of knowing what you stand for. You have to know what you stand for. There's a beautiful quote by Socrates. He says, "The beginning of wisdom is the definition of terms." And that is profoundly true. You have to know what are your values, what are the ideas that you hold actually represent. So know your terms. Now, I want to move on to another thinker who was a student of Plato for 20 years. And that is Aristotle. So Aristotle flourished around the 4th century, and a bit of background about him. So for the first 20 years of his philosophical pursuits, he was a Platonist. He studied under Plato in the Academy, which is the university that Plato founded. And following Plato's death, Aristotle retired from the Academy, did a lot of thinking, and came to the conclusion that he is diametrically opposed to his teacher's teachings on every fundamental issue. And Aristotle developed the second coherent, consistent system of philosophy. He founded a school, which was competition to the Academy, known as the Lyceum. And when I said that it is hard to overemphasize how much of a genius Plato was in his originality, that applies tenfold to Aristotle. Aristotle's philosophy is, it is hard to fathom how one person can come up with it entirely on their own. So what Aristotle taught me, funnily enough, is a response to the lesson that we just discussed. Because the sophists tell us that if you're bad by nature, and if you're virtuous by nature. Well, Aristotle says that's not the case. No one is virtuous by nature. And he then says, but it's also true that to be good isn't against your nature, like the sophists tell us. He says, if you want to be virtuous, if you want to be good, if you want to be righteous, you need to develop the right habits. You need to develop the right habits to become more productive, more virtuous. And today, there's a very strong emphasis and an increasing trend of writers and self-help influencers to discuss the formation of habits, the importance of habits, discussing how we are habitual creatures. Well, we are, and this is one of the first identifications of that exact fact. So if any of you guys read books like Atomic Habits, you might be interested in reading the Nicomachean Ethics and seeing what Aristotle had to say about habit formation. Now, as opposed to Plato and Socrates, who say that if you want to be virtuous, you need to know what it is, they, in addition to saying that you need to know what it is, Plato and Socrates, they say that ignorance is the cause of any bad behavior. And what Aristotle says is, well, guys, it's true that you need to know what it is to be good in order to be good. It's true that you need to know what it is to be virtuous in order to be virtuous. But that's not enough. It's not enough to know what it is. You also need to make the choice to be good. You need to make the choice to be virtuous. And also, you choose to be bad. You choose to do things that are immoral or wrong. And that premise that Socrates and Plato have, that to be good, you need to know what it is and that is enough, is one that Aristotle challenges very heavily. And that emphasis of choice is incredibly important. Otherwise, you can very easily go down that determinist rabbit hole that Plato and Socrates only slightly open the door to. Okay, so going back to habits. Well, Aristotle says that it isn't one action that determines who you are. It's consistency. Consistency is who we are. It's the consistent actions that we take. And that is what is known as habits, the habits that we form. So, the habits that we form, the actions that we take, are what can develop our character. And character is another interesting word, because the ancient Greek word for character is character. And what it literally translates to is to etch, to engrave. So character, what we know as character, in ancient Greek is to etch, to engrave. And if you think about it, if you think about how words develop, does it surprise anyone that our conception of character, number one up there, is where number two comes from number two? Because what do we do when we form our character? We literally engrave principles and values and ideas into who we are. We etch them into our soul. That sculpture up there is a sculpture that I really like. It's called Self-Made Man. And I think it's a very good visual representation of what Aristotle is talking about. When we form who we are both the marble and the sculptor. And Aristotle, he says to us that because we are both the marble and the sculptor, and he doesn't use these words, the process of habit formation, of character building, is not effortless. It takes time, takes persistence, perseverance, takes effort. And when you etch something into your soul, or when you scrub out something, it's often painful. So he gives us some really practical advice on how to do it. He says, start small. You don't have to change your entire character overnight. Start with small changes, which will gradually accumulate into more significant changes of character. He says to us, be active, be conscious, and this is probably the most important point. Be conscious about the actions that you take, about the thoughts that you think, and be conscious a lot of the time. What do I mean by this? So I used to pull out my phone, check the time, put it back in my pocket, and as soon as it was back in my pocket, I had no idea what time it was. And I would do that, 8 times a day. And when I started really critically analyzing the actions I take, critically thinking about the thoughts that just pop into my head and why they pop into my head, I realized that I've picked up some habits that I didn't consciously choose. We're habitual creatures. We all have habits. If we don't consciously choose them, they will be subconsciously imprinted into us. So he says to us, start small, be conscious, and know where you're going. So when a sculptor encounters a block of marble, sometimes he might just chip and then end up with whatever he ends up with. But it's good to have an image in mind of the ideal, what you're working towards. That way you know which areas to chip off, where to refine, where to smooth. That can be in the form of idealized principles, role models. You see them around you, great, and if you don't, it's what literature is for. And this is a continuous process, continuously chipping away, improving ourselves, and smoothing out the rough around the edges. So start small, be conscious about the things that you do. And I really encourage everyone here to pick up on one thing that they did today that they're not necessarily sure that they chose to do so. And I have many of those every day. Aristotle has a really poetic quote that emphasizes this point. He says, "As it is not one swallow or a fine day that makes a spring, so it is not one day or a short time that makes a man blessed and happy." What he's telling us is that it's not one action, it's not one thought, it's consistency. Habits are incredibly important to developing who we are. They are who we are. And Aristotle has some very, very wise advice on how we form these habits. Now, the Greeks have countless more lessons to teach us about every aspect of our life. And I don't want the next two slides to make anyone think that they don't, but I am going to jump not only several hundred years ahead, but also civilizations. So the next thinkers I want to talk about are the Stoics. I want to talk about, in particular, two of my favorite Stoics. Bit of background about the Stoics. So after the decline of the classical Greek world and the rise of the Roman Empire, we see a rise in this new philosophy that is really based on one central tenet, and that is that you should act in accordance, you should live in accordance, act in accordance with your nature. And our nature is to live by reason, and our emotions are counter to that. So we want to focus on living by reason and try and avoid living by or with or in accordance our our emotions. Now, we've heard a bit about the Stoics over the course of this weekend, but I don't want to get into them in too much depth. I have a lot of problems with the Stoics, more than I have positive things to say about them, and you can ask me about that in the Q&A if you're interested. But for this presentation, that is not relevant. The three main Stoics, the three most influential Stoics, are Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, and Epictetus. Epictetus I don't have up here for reasons of brevity. Marcus Aurelius was a Roman emperor. Marcus Aurelius was a solitary Stoic. He was not a philosopher, at least not in the literal sense that we know the word today. Marcus Aurelius did not write for the public. Seneca, on the other hand, was advisor to Emperor Nero. Seneca was more of like an in-house philosopher. We know Seneca mostly through his letters. And if you know anything about Emperor Nero, I'll just say, don't let that ruin your view of Seneca. And let's just give him the benefit of the doubt that he didn't have much influence over Nero. So what the Stoics really emphasize is a lesson that we've kind of heard already through the decades, through the centuries, and it's that you need to know yourself. You need to know yourself if you're going to you need to know and master yourself. And Seneca, he talks a lot about this in his letters. He talks about how it's important to have a purpose, important to find a purpose. And a purpose is similar to what Aristotle is talking about with his character. But a character is more about who we are, and a purpose is more about that thing out there that we're out to get. And it doesn't have to be even an external thing. It's an integration of external and internal. And Seneca says that if you don't have this thing, if you don't have this purpose, if you don't have that destination, that direction to which you're going, well, what does it matter if things throw you off the particular path you're on? Because any path is as good as any other if there's nowhere you're actually going. He says to us, if a man knows not to which port he sails, no wind is favorable. And that is such a profound an observation. You need to know where you're going. You need to have a purpose, a destination. Otherwise, what does it matter if anything happens to you in life? Like, it really doesn't. It makes no difference. The way I like to think about it is we're all on some path. And things do happen to us. External things do happen to us. And we can also internally choose to move between different paths. But say we don't choose and we're on a particular path. Well, what does it matter if something external happens and throws us off this path and onto another if we're not going in one particular direction? So Seneca really emphasizes that you need to know where you're going. You need to know your destination. But how? Like, how do you know what that purpose is? How do you find that destination? How do you know which direction is the right direction for you? And here Marcus Aurelius has some fantastic advice. And it's funny because he didn't intend this to be advice. So another interesting fact about Marcus Aurelius, I mentioned he wasn't a public philosopher. He was a Roman emperor. And we know about him through his work, Meditations. Meditations were private notes that he wrote to himself before he went to bed and when he woke up. And Marcus Aurelius did not want these works to be published. Imagine writing your most inner deep thoughts and then having them published into the entire world. Like, Marcus Aurelius explicitly said, I want them to be burnt. But his friend, of course, after he died, read them and said, I can't burn these things. They're too valuable. The world needs to read these thoughts that Marcus had. And there's a conflict in me because I am a supporter of intellectual property rights. But on the other hand, I'm so grateful that he did violate those rights and publish Marcus Aurelius's books, because Meditations is really an incredible work. And so getting back to the point, Seneca tells us you need a purpose, you need a destination, you need to know where you're going. How do you do that? And Marcus Aurelius, he tells us there is only one way to figure out what that is. And that is to introspect, to ask yourself questions, to dig deep within yourself. And eventually, you will find what you're looking for. You will find the answers to these questions. Marcus Aurelius says that, and he has this quote, he says, dig deep within yourself. And if you will keep digging, there is a fountain of goodness that you will find ever ready to flow if you will keep digging. And that is certainly true. That's the fountain of goodness, by the way. Also AI. Took ages. Anyway, so if you introspect, retrospect, reflect, ask yourself very difficult questions about who you are and what you value. Echoing what we learned from Plato and Socrates, don't be content with ambiguity. No, like if you think, oh, I think I like this thing. Well, why? Do you or do you not like this thing? I think I believe in this. Well, get to a point where you're certain. And that is what Marcus Aurelius is telling us. He says, you need to reflect and introspect in order to find these things that are essential for a well-lived life. And there's a very important point that you have to choose to do this. This is a choice. You can't just sit down one day and reflect for 5 minutes and expect everything to fall into place. It goes back to what Aristotle was saying, to form the right habits. So you've got to choose to go on this journey of self-discovery, of digging until you find that fountain of goodness. And luckily, Marcus Aurelius has one last great piece of advice. And ironically, of course, he didn't intend it to be so. As I mentioned, Marcus Aurelius would write down his notes in his journal, the meditations before he went to bed, when he woke up, and on other occasions. And I think there's something very valuable that we can learn from his practice of doing so. Journaling is an incredibly valuable tool in figuring out what one stands for, who one is, and where one is going. I found that often my subconscious mind doesn't want to cooperate with my conscious mind. Sometimes I'll get a feeling and I'll think to myself, why do I feel this way? And my subconscious mind is just refusing to talk to my conscious mind. But there is one thing my subconscious mind never refuses to do, and that is to communicate with pen and paper. When I take a pen and paper and I just let my mind flow and I don't even think about what I'm writing, I see a fountain of goodness right in front of me. And I think that's a great lesson we can learn from Marcus. Writing things down, letting your subconscious just run wild, is an incredibly useful tool on figuring out what we are feeling, what we are thinking, and why. And more often than not, when you have that visual representation, some people are visual thinkers. Some people think in words and concepts. Other people think in other ways. When you have a visual representation of your thoughts, it is entirely unlikely that you are not going to see new insights into what you were thinking, to what you were feeling. So Marcus Aurelius really has, we can learn so much from Marcus, even though he did not intend us to. Now, the ancient Greeks, the Stoics, they have so many more lessons that they can teach us. Homer, as every single one of these, and there are so many others that I haven't included in this presentation, but in 45 minutes, Homer has taught us that if you master your mind, you master your ship, you master your life. And if you master your ship, well, it doesn't really matter if you don't know where you're sailing. So you want to figure out your purpose. You want to figure out where you're going. You need to know yourself, search your soul, dig deep. And don't be content with ambiguity. We learn that from Plato and Socrates. Like, know your definitions, know your concepts, know what you're talking about. And eventually, if you're consistent and persistently engage in this continuous process, you will come across this fountain of goodness that Marcus Aurelius is talking about. But to do so, you have to form habits. You have to form good, life-serving, productive habits. We have to listen to what Aristotle is teaching us. And again, start small. Be conscious of the actions that you take. Be active. Have a future picture, have a vision in mind of what you're sculpting and molding, which principles and values you're etching and engraving into yourself, into your soul. and form productive habits. 20 minutes a day, reflection, introspection, 10 minutes, journaling. It's all it takes. Small steps, Aristotle tells us. Unfortunately, these are the exact lessons that are not only lost on so many people, but were lost on the people that I mentioned right at the get-go. And at the extreme, if you lose on these lessons do become a matter of life and death. The ancient Greeks have countless more lessons and morals to teach us. The fact that the ancient Greeks were great thinkers is not in our control. Whether we choose to listen is. Thank you.
Hi, thanks for your presentation. It was really thought-provoking. My question is, what are the greatest differences between biblical and Grecian morality, and how does this contrast values play out today in modern political debates?
So what are the greatest differences between biblical and Greco values?
Yes.
And how do those differences play out in today's debates?
Yes.
Okay. I'm going to touch just on a few fundamentals. The first is the naturalism of Greek mythology. So, for one, the Greeks did have mythological stories about gods, but the Greek gods are, as we've seen in the Odyssey, they're not these omniscient, omnipotent gods that can control everything and everything is directed by their will. But rather, you can think of them as like big brothers to mankind, because the Greek gods, they bicker amongst themselves and they fight and they cheat on each other. And they have these very human qualities. They're anthropomorphized in a sense. And I think that instills in a culture the value of what I discussed when I was talking about Homer, of living your own life, thinking for yourself. No one's going to take on that responsibility if you don't do it. And so there's a naturalism in the Greeks, as opposed to in the biblical stories where divine intervention pretty much sets the theme of any story that develops. In addition to that, the Greeks really did worship, and I mean worship in a literal sense. They worshipped mankind. They worshipped human beings in the sense of like greatness. I mean, if you look at, you see this most evidently in art. If anyone here frequents art galleries, go to the ancient Greek sections and then go to medieval art. It is shocking seeing the contrast. You see depictions of heroic men and beautiful women, and then you go a few centuries later, and suddenly you see people weak and feeble, no color, dying, suffering. And I think art is a great representation of the dominant ideas, the culture of a time. So I don't want to hog the entire Q&A with this particular question, and we can talk about that later, but I think go to art galleries, see the ancient Greeks' depiction and understanding of what it is to be a human, and then go and see the pre-Renaissance and post-Greek medieval Dark Ages period of art history.
All right, thank you. So, like we talked about Stoics, what do you don't like, or what do you think is wrong about Stoics, basically?
Okay, where do I start? So I don't want to hog the mic too long on this, but I think one of the things that was very evident when I was reading the Seneca's letters or the Meditations is this notion of fate. I want to before I even answer this question, I want to make a clarification. There is a difference between Stoicism as it was incepted, as it was thought about by Marcus Aurelius and Seneca and Epicurus and Zeno and some of the other Stoics, as to what people see and promote Stoicism as today. So, quick survey. Who here likes Stoic ideas or Stoicism? Okay, who here feels like they're confident that they know all of the aspects of what Stoicism means? Well, I like a lot of quotes, and that's how I came into philosophy generally. Like, I found Marcus Aurelius' quotes, and I'm like, whoa, that guy, he's cool. And then when you actually read his works, he's talking about how there are gods in chairs and gods are in everything, and he's talking about how I don't actually have my independent will, but we have fate. We're fated to end up wherever we are. And you see this deterministic notion in the Stoic writing that recurs again and again and again. And in addition to that, I'm now going to say a sentence that I never say, but I'm going to agree with Hegel. I think that he was right when he said that Stoicism is really a slave philosophy. When you're Epictetus, he was a slave, and one of the key selling points of Stoicism is that it's a philosophy both for the emperor and the slave. And I think that I think Hegel was more right about this. It's a philosophy for the slave. When you can't control the things around you, when you literally can't control the things around you, you are fated to just end up in whatever someone else, your master, determines. But that isn't the case. That isn't an aspect of human nature, and it certainly isn't the case anymore in the modern world, at least in the more rights-respecting sides of the modern world. The deterministic aspect